So I guess the death of any child, regardless of the cause of that death or their age, is overwhelming to parents. And in a real sense, you can never be prepared for a child to die before you. And we know that parental grief is often really intense. It's long-lasting and often complex. With the death of an adult child, there are additional factors. Often other people assume that when the child died as an adult, that in some way that their grief is less intense than if they were younger. I think parents of an older child who've died often find that their grief is sort of discounted or not acknowledged. I think it's often complex too, because often adults are independent from families and have their own lives. That can also add further complications, particularly if there is a partner or children that have also impacted by bereavement as well. There's a real sense that we don't outlive our children, and so it kind of violates the beliefs we have about the way the world operates. But I think a lot of the problems that bereaved people have are social problems. It's other people not knowing how to respond to them, not being able to join with them. And often the language that people use is really very unhelpful. Think of the good times, or think of all those years that you had with them, or other comments that in a way minimise or try to distract the parent from that experience. The really unhelpful beliefs is this idea that death is about saying goodbye and letting go. And we know that after the death of somebody that we love or in a relationship with, that we don't say goodbye or let go. Death ends a life, it doesn't end a relationship. And so there's still a very strong emotional connection, which many parents will continue and many bereaved people continue in memory and thought. So there is no getting over or putting it beyond us. We live forward and we carry that loss with us.
I only think of the good times that I had with my parents who I've lost, and my nana who was very special to me. And I think that's good, the way that works. We forget about maybe the fights or the arguments. We seem to remember the good times, and that's pretty positive grieving for me anyway.
In a real sense, we do have a continuing connection, and sometimes those relationships are complicated. And so as we move forward in our own lives, there might be aspects of that relationship we continue, and there might be other aspects that we let fall away. But this idea that we maintain this connection, it's not about saying goodbye or letting go. That's not what people do. And that this relationship continues to nourish us and also provide a sense of comfort. I think one of the things that many parents miss is hearing the name of their child who has died. They're immediately kind of relegated it to history. Being able to find other people who understand that particular grief of losing an adult child is really important.
Chris, I read that there's a bereaved fathers group. Is that because we tend to think mothers grieve more than fathers?
That's certainly part of it. I believe our culture often thinks that grief is all about emotions and dealing with the emotions of the loss. But that's really only one aspect of grief. It's also about how we think about the loss, how we make sense of it. It's often linked to the sorts of things we do and think. And so we often talk about people have different styles of grieving. There are some people who are very comfortable talking about their feelings and emotions. There are others who are much more private about their grief, who perhaps get the support they need from online and so forth. So what we created was a group called Men at the Bar. And this is a group of guys who meet at a pub in Melbourne, and they have rules about how they manage that, but they have a room there. They find that as a really comfortable environment. In fact, one of the things we found when we moved that group online is that it kind of lost some of its benefits because people really enjoyed that background noise, that hum, rather than, in a sense, being left with silence. But really it's about creating a safe place where people can come together and talk about, in a reasonably unstructured way, about their experience and to share what works and what doesn't work. And so when we think about bereavement support, we really need to think creatively about that. And it's often about finding a safe place, a comfortable space where people feel that they can talk to others and also share that kind of tragic wisdom of others who've been through a similar experience of loss.
What's the best thing to say to people who've just lost a child?
Well, I don't think there is a best thing that we can say. Sometimes the best thing we can say is, I wish there were words. Sometimes the best thing is not what we say, but what we do. So rather than using words, we take ourselves. We provide practical support. What people appreciate is the effort. Even if those words are difficult to find or perhaps even not even the best words, we know that people appreciate the acknowledgement of the experience that they're going through. We know that social support starts to drop away 3 to 4 days after the death. By the time you've defrosted the last casserole and thrown out the last bunch of flowers, our culture has this view that life gets back to normal. And it doesn't for a bereaved person. Their grief can be felt more intensely on the second anniversary than the first. And so I think what we're after is a long-term commitment to use the person's name who's died and to simply convey loving care and compassion, to acknowledge this loss. Often sharing a story or an experience or even a funny event can be a really warming and helpful thing to do. Sometimes if we can't find the words, even writing a note can be a helpful way of simply acknowledging the experience the person has gone through.
Words on paper, meaningful words on paper, can be held dear for many years, can't they?
They can.
Do you have any other messages you'd like to pass on to our listeners?
Grief is the price you pay for love. Sometimes that's a really high price, but you can't have, in a sense, one without the other. For most people, what continues to astound me is their resiliency, their ability to bounce back after the most incredible losses in their lives. As I said, many of the problems are social ones, so reach out. I feel sometimes that we tend to talk about the use of the word death and talk about passing away or slipping away. I often feel that we're in the same place that the sex education movement was in the 60s. We're even reluctant to use words or to talk about it because of the anxiety that it generates. It's certainly true that there's a small proportion of people who struggle, and they struggle terribly following a loss, and that there are lots of supports out there for people who are really finding that this is a loss that's really is disabling. But certainly I'd encourage people to reach out. Our organisation, the Compassionate Friends, where you can talk to other parents who've experienced the death of an adult child, the shared wisdom of others who've had a similar experience can be really powerful.
Thank you so much, Chris, for being with us today, and we hope that you might join us again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And now it's time to have a cuppa in Jeff's Cafe, where we join older Australians talking about all the issues of the day.
Welcome again to Jeff's Cafe. Today we're going to be talking about the interview we just heard with Chris Hall on losing a child in later life. And we have two guests from the Bereaved Fathers Group. Philip from Ferntree Gully. Hello, Philip, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you, Jeff?
Very good. Brian from Bundoora. How are you, Brian?
Oh, well, thanks, Jeff.
And we have Lucille from Summer Hill. How are you today, Lucille?
I'm well, thanks, Jeff. And thanks for having me.
And I'll just mention, Lucille, you recently lost a grandchild.
I did.
Our condolences, of course, to everybody. But I'm going to begin, please, with you, Philip. One thing that Chris mentioned is that grief and love are opposite sides of the same coin. Is that your experience?
Yes, I think it is. When Lizzie died, that was in 2017 on the 24th of March, 3:15 p.m. My last words to Lizzie were that it's okay to let go and we all love you. We'd sat with Lizzie for the last 24 hours of her life, watching her struggle. She was taken by ovarian cancer. About 3 or 4 breaths after I said those words to her, she stopped breathing. And that's when my life fell apart. From that love for my daughter, I brought my daughter up because I had health issues at the time and we switched roles. So I brought her up and we were very close. It was a very, very trying time. The breath she took was like a stab in my heart. So, yeah, I definitely agree. Grief and love are both intertwined, and the depth of your grief, I think, reflects the amount of love you had for that person. One thing I want to say is that when you lose a child, there's no use-by date on the grief you have for that loss.
It is difficult, isn't it? My background is as a nurse as well, and people often say you never really get over it, you just learn to live with it, and that's probably fairly accurate, I would say.
One thing I've discovered is men grieve totally different to women. my first reaction